welcome everybody. It is nice to see you. I'm Rachel Scheinerman. I edit My Jewish Learning and have the pleasure of hosting so many interesting classes. Today we are here to discuss the temple's destruction, three different ancient accounts, of course, in preparation for Tisha B'Av, which falls this weekend. And I am delighted to welcome Dr. Sara Ronis of St. Mary's University to teach us today. So Dr. Ronis, I think we are all in the door and we can go ahead and get started.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Scheinerman. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining us. Um, I see some folks already introducing themselves in the chat. If you have not already started telling us where you're joining us from, please feel free to join on in. Um, so today's class is designed to help us prepare for Tisha B'Av. So I thought I would start off with just a quick informational piece for those of us whose Jewish calendar gets away from us, that Tisha B'Av this year, it starts on the evening of Saturday, August 2nd, and it goes until the evening of Sunday, August 3rd. And, you know, uh, for what exact times those are, feel free to uh, Google in your local time zone. I am joining you today from sunny and very hot San Antonio, Texas. So I wanted to start with a question, and you should feel free to either raise your hand and Rachel can find you and unmute you, or you can drop it in the chat. What does Tisha B'Av commemorate? Right. One of the things teachers are supposed to do is always assess the amount of knowledge of the class before you join in. So, what does Tisha B'Av commemorate? Okay, Susan in the chat writes the destruction of the first and second temples. Right. So, Susan, you are absolutely correct. Janine adds, and I appreciate this, also other things. Absolutely, Janine. So let me just share with you our central text that lists what Tisha B'Av commemorates.
Amy says everything else the rabbis wanted to lump in.
Yes, right. So once we have a day of mourning, it becomes a traditional day of mourning for all kinds of other things. Let us see, right here are the
Thomas
five
says
things.
I'm sorry, I
Yeah.
can stop reading the chat for you if you
No,
want.
please, I can't see it while I'm talking to it. I've got many windows up, so jump
Thomas
on.
points out that it's tragedies linked specifically to this day or season.
Yes, right. So Tisha B'Av is a name that's a really helpful piece, right? The word Tisha means nine. Av is the month, the name of the month. So Tisha B'Av, the day, is like we might think of today like names like September 11th or October 7th, right? It's a date, but it's a date with huge historical resonances. So Mishnah Ta'anit tells us that on the ninth of Av, it was decreed upon our ancestors five things. One, that they would not enter the land of Israel. Two, the temple was destroyed the first time and the second time. That's three. And Beitar was conquered. That's during the suppression of the Bar Kokhba revolt. And fifth, the city of Jerusalem was plowed over and turned into the Roman city of Aelia Capitolina. And I'm seeing a number of folks in the chat noting that throughout Jewish history, we have attached other horrific events to be mourned on this day. The classic examples of this are the expulsion from Spain and the burning of the Talmud in 1240. Um, I will happily, so for folks who are asking, there will be a source sheet. I will share it when we get there. I'm also happy to share the PowerPoint. So after class, when Dr. Scheinerman sends out the recording, I will also email Dr. Scheinerman the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint has some surprise animation pieces, so I don't want you to have it yet, but you will get that afterwards. Okay, so Tisha B'Av commemorates these five things originally, and then other pieces get added. And we could offer a class about literally every one of these things at some other point. That could be a series. Today's class is really going to be focusing in on the second time the temple was destroyed in the year 70. And perhaps, um, I always go back and forth on should we say the temple was destroyed or did somebody destroy the temple, right? Active versus passive verbs. But I want us to, for now, leave it a little vague. So, in our time together today, I want us to be thinking about three really big questions, right? Question one, what actually happened in the year 70, right? We are commemorating a historical event. It would be helpful to know the history. Second big question, why was the temple destroyed, right? So, one of the things that happens in the year 70 is that the temple is destroyed. Why did that happen? Right. And we can answer that question in a lot of different ways. We're going to see people answer that question in a lot of different ways. And then the third question, and this is, I think, what I'm hoping we leave here with, right, is how do we as individuals and communities find meaning in what happened on Tisha B'Av, right? If we're talking about historical events that happened in the year 70, how do we find meaning today, right? So that we're not just hungry, but are hungry or cranky or get a caffeine headache if you're me, but are working to really understand and connect to the events on Tisha B'Av, but as people who live in the world today. So those are our big three questions. And our plan to approach these is going to be to look at three ancient accounts of what happened in the year 70. The first account is going to be from Josephus. Then we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about an account by Cassius Dio. And then we're going to talk about the account from the Babylonian Talmud. So we are going to start with Josephus. Now, Josephus is, right, so that's our plan, if you're ever feeling lost. Now, I have done a thing that you're really not supposed to do, which is I've put way too many words on the PowerPoint. So the PowerPoint is going to be chock full of text. I apologize. There is even more text, and you can blow it up to whatever size you want on the source sheet that Dr. Scheinerman has shared, and maybe we'll share again. But I will also read everything that is on the text, that is on the PowerPoint, so that if the words are too small for you, you can just follow along in audio. So let's start with Josephus. Now, Josephus was a Jewish historian. He was born Yosef ben Matityahu in Jerusalem. Like many people, he had a Hebrew name and sort of a Greek/Roman version of his name. Right, so his name in Greek is Josephus. He's born in 37 CE in Jerusalem, and he dies in 100 CE, about 100 CE in Rome. And he originally participated in the revolt before he surrendered and defected to the Romans. He's taken to Rome after the Great Revolt. He falls under the protection of the Flavian dynasty, the emperors, and so he takes on Flavius as a sign of his connection to the Flavians. And in his post-revolt career, he becomes a historian, and he writes 4 books of Jewish history from Rome. So that is his sort of life story. And he is a profoundly Jewish historian, right? He says he's Jewish, he talks about Jewish history. He is also writing in Greek. So he is writing for an audience which is probably a mix of Jews and non-Jews who are interested in learning about this history. Okay, so let's jump in. So the first thing I'm going to do is I did not bring you 20 pages of his book, The War of the Jews. So I'm going to summarize for you a couple of things, and then we'll look at some text. So he writes an entire book just about the Great Revolt, called The Wars of the Jews, or the History of the Destruction of Jerusalem. And in that book, over the course of about 20 pages, he outlines what I would say are 3 causes of the revolt, right? 3 reasons that the Jews revolted against the Roman Empire at this time. The first reason that he identifies is terrible Roman procurators. This is basically the official um, Rome's official representative in the province, who are in charge of tax collection, among other things. So nobody likes tax collectors, and these ones happen to be truly terrible. Um, in fact, the Romans end up thinking they're terrible as well. So they are some really bad government administrators who do things like uh, raid the temple and take its gold stuff, and then murder a lot of people who are mad about it. So really bad procurators. The second cause of the revolt that Josephus identifies is structural, right? Which is to say that when you have a problem with the representative of the Romans, what you want to do is you want to go and tell the Romans, hey, this guy is bad. We need to get rid of him. One of the things to understand about the ancient world is that it's really far. It takes a long time to get to Rome. And so, if you have a problem with a local governor in one region, it can take weeks to get news of that to Rome. And then by the time the Romans have to decide what to do, they have to maybe debate it, maybe the Senate has to meet, then they have to come up with a resolution. That can take months. So somebody who is in place and is a terrible leader can do a lot of damage in 2 months. Even if their government is working the way it's supposed to, the structure allows bad actors to continue to be bad for a really long time. So those are two of the causes that Josephus identifies, right? Terrible Roman leaders, and then a system where it's really hard to get terrible Roman leaders out. And then the third piece, and this I've already seen.
Are folks seeing Dr. Ronis? I just want to make sure it's not just my computer.
I
Okay,
just got kicked out, but then just came back in.
welcome back.
Thank you. I blame the Romans. So the third thing that Josephus identifies, and this is one that I've already seen people hinting at in the chat, is internal Jewish conflict between the Jewish aristocracy and some of the other groups of Jews in this time period. The aristocracy largely was very pro-Roman, right? People who do well under a particular government system tend to like it. That's why they're an aristocracy. And people who don't do well under a particular system tend to not like it. And so we see lots of different Jewish groups at the time, and there are tons of conflicts between the pro-Roman aristocracy and one group in particular, a group that Josephus calls the Zealots, right? Right. A group that Josephus calls the Zealots, who are strongly, strongly opposed to Roman rule in the land, both for theological reasons, right? That um, they believe that God should be in control and that the Jews should be living under a Jewish theocracy, and also political reasons around autonomy, around bad leadership in Rome, etc. So he identifies these major three structural causes of the revolt. And the revolt kicks off, the revolt is happening. So let's look at some of his account of the revolt. And as we're reading these, I want us to really be thinking about how each of the stories that we're looking at, each of these three ancient accounts, is going to offer us a different account from a very different perspective. And we're going to see how telling different versions of the story made different kinds of meaning in different contexts. Right. So in all of the three accounts, right, as we're about to sort of read Josephus's words, we want to be aware not just of the story they're telling, but who the storyteller is, who their intended audience is, and what their goal is in telling the story in the way that they are. Right. So some really important, media literacy skills that we want to be practicing as we're reading all three of these accounts. So let's start with Josephus's words. So the commander of revolt, when the revolt starts out, the commander is a man by the name of Vespasian. Vespasian eventually gets called back to Rome to become the Roman emperor. And he leaves his son, whose name is Titus, to be the general in charge of the revolt. So at this point, Titus, spoiler alert, eventually Titus is going to become the emperor. But right now, he is the general of the Romans who are fighting the Jews in the Great Revolt. Titus himself gathered his commanders together. Titus proposed to these that they should give him their advice. What should be done about the holy house, right? So they're besieging Jerusalem and they're asking, what should we do with the temple when we get there? Um, Now, some of these thought it would be the best way to act according to the rules of war and demolish it, because the Jews would never leave off rebelling while that house was standing, at which house it was that they used to all get together. Right? So the temple becomes a central focal point for the Jews to gather, and it's also a place that the Jews would defend to their lives. So as long as it is standing, it's a problem, say some of the Roman commanders. Others of them were of the opinion that in case the Jews would leave it and none of them would lay their arms up in it, he might save it. But that in case they got upon it and fought anymore, he might burn it, because then it might be looked upon not as a holy house, but as a citadel, and that the impiety of burning it would then belong to those that forced this to be done and not to them. Right? So another group says, well, we should give them an ultimatum. If you leave the temple alone, we won't destroy it. But if you start fighting in the temple, you are going to turn the temple from a temple to a battleground. And if it's a battleground, we can destroy it. So those are the two positions that um, that his commanders lay out. But Titus said that although the Jews should get upon that holy house and fight us thence, yet ought not we to revenge ourselves on things that are inanimate instead of on the men themselves, and that he was not in any case for burning down so vast a work as that, because this would be a mischief to the Romans themselves, as it would be an ornament to their government while it continued. So Titus listens to his commanders and he says, first of all, we fight people, not buildings. So it doesn't make sense to destroy a building if what we're trying to do is fight the people who rebelled against us. And second, he says, it's actually a beautiful building, and us being in control of it would make us, would make us really even more glorious to the world. And so Titus is not for burning it down. He decides he's not going to destroy the temple. That's his discussion. That's his decision. All right, let's keep going. Now, so that's their plan before. But as we all know, as the Yiddish saying goes, right, Mensch trägt und Gott lacht, right? Humans plan things and God laughs in your face. So here's Josephus's account of what actually happens. And those of you who are looking at the handout has more words than this. So just be aware there's more of the story if you want to look at it after. But as for that house, God had for certain long ago doomed it to the fire. And now that fatal day was come, according to the revolution of ages. It was the 10th of the month, Lus, which is another word for Av, upon which it was formerly burnt by the king of Babylon. Now, I know you're thinking to yourself, wait, isn't this all happening on the 9th and not the 10th? According to Josephus, this happens on the 10th. According to other traditions, we'll see it starts on the 9th and continues to burn into the 10th. So that's sort of why the 9th is the day, right? That's when the walls, that's when things are set on fire and the destruction starts. But Josephus is talking about what happens on the 10th. Although these flames took their rise from the Jews themselves and were occasioned by them. For upon Titus's retiring, right, so Titus goes to bed on the 10th. The seditious lay still, sorry, on the 9th. The seditious lay still for a little while and then attacked the Romans again. And when those that guarded the holy house fought with those that quenched the fire that was burning in the inner courtyard of the temple. But these Romans put the Jews to fight and proceeded as far as the holy house itself. Okay, so what happens? Titus goes to sleep because he's a human and humans need to sleep sometime. And while Titus is asleep, the zealots attack the Romans again. And then they attack the Romans and they get into this fight. And in this fight, the a little piece of the inner court is put on fire. It's the fire is taken out, and the Romans take basically the whole temple plaza. So they have reached the temple. At which time one of the soldiers, without staying for any orders, and without any concern or dread upon him at so great an undertaking, and being hurried on by a certain divine fury, snatched somewhat out of the materials that were on fire, and being lifted up by another soldier, he set fire to a golden window, through which there was a passage to the rooms that were round about the holy house on the north side of it. As the flames went upward, the Jews made a great clamor, such as so mighty an affliction required, and ran together to prevent it. And now they spared not their lives any more, nor suffered anything to restrain their force, since that holy house was perishing, for whose sake it was that they kept such a guard about it. Right, so Titus is still asleep. The skirmish continues. And as the skirmish is continuing, one Roman soldier on his own sets a piece of a window on fire, and the flames. Yeah, I sort of imagine, when oxygen hits flames and they sort of whoosh, right? So they whoosh into the temple, and the temple is burned. All right, so that's Josephus's account. And now I'm going to do the thing that teachers do, where I stop and ask us to reflect on what we just read. So, according to Josephus, who destroyed the temple and why? You can raise your hand, you can put it in the chat. I'll even open the chat so that maybe I can see things.
I'll keep an eye. Everybody always needs a minute to think
Yep.
before responding. Soldiers asking without orders. Acting, I'm sorry. Exigencies of war.
Mhm.
Not his patron, the soldier, the Romans, perhaps in anticipation of attacks. Whoop. Sorry, it's scrolling against me. Sorry, folks. The chat is scrolling away from me and I'm trying to read it.
So, so I'm hearing two things, right?
Josephus says it was preordained by God. More people pointing out the Roman soldiers. Other people saying God.
Okay, wonderful. So that's exactly what I wanted us to take from this text, right? Josephus has there are two different pieces of this account. One is who destroyed the temple? A single Roman soldier, not the Roman emperor, right? Not Titus, not the government. One guy in the heat of war is one answer. And his second answer is God, right? This could never have happened if God had not ordained that this was supposed to happen. And so, who ultimately destroyed, and in fact, if we just go back for 1 minute and we look, you can see the being right that a single soldier is being hurried on by a certain divine fury, right? That God is the one who has ordained that the temple be destroyed at this time, right? And now the time has come according to the revolution of the ages. So, who destroyed the temple? I see somebody say, not his patron, right? Not his patron. And that's important to know, right? The Flavius in Flavius Josephus comes from the Flavian dynasty, and the Flavian dynasty includes Vespasian and Titus. So, and I also just want to note one piece about this, and then we'll move on to Cassius Dio, which is that Josephus was an eyewitness account of these events. Now, that doesn't mean he was neutral, but of all of our accounts, Josephus is the one who lived through these events, and lived through these events in proximity to the either actually fighting at the beginning of the revolt or in the Roman household in the second part of the revolt. All right, let's move
I
on
think that
to
speaks to the last question in the chat, which is just how reliable is Josephus?
great question.
One of the million-dollar questions.
That is a really tough question, and it's one that historians and scholars debate today. But we can't discount the power of an eyewitness. right? I mean, eyewitness testimony, anyone here who is in law, you know eyewitness testimony is very unreliable, but he certainly is our oldest account of these events. And he's a Jewish account of these events, and we see that here, right? Even though we get a sense he's trying to keep Titus out of it, right? He's trying to keep Titus out of it. So we see some loyalty perhaps to the Romans, but he's also genuinely does not think this could have happened if God didn't make it happen, right? I mean, an important piece of his story too. So let's move on to Cassius Dio. Cassius Dio lived about 50 years later, after the destruction of the temple. And so he is a Roman historian in the Roman city of Nicaea. Um, in the Roman city of Nicaea. So today that is in Turkey. And he is a Roman historian. He wrote an 80-volume Roman history called the Historia Romana, very creatively, much of which survives until today. And here is how he describes the event. Rahel, I see someone requesting to repost the source sheet. Can we do that while I
Yep,
read? Awesome. Thank you.
there it is.
All right. So first, let's start with how Cassius Dio describes the start of the revolt. While Nero, so before we have Vespasian, Nero is the Roman emperor. While Nero was still in Greece, the Jews revolted openly, and he sent Vespasian against them. Also, the inhabitants of Britain and of Gaul, oppressed by the taxes, were becoming more vexed and inflamed than ever. So let's stop there. According to Cassius Dio, why did the Jews revolt in the year 66? What are the causes of the revolt? So I'm seeing folks discuss taxes, and I want to note here that the inhabitants of Britain and Gaul, it says, revolt because of their taxes. It doesn't say that about the Jews. Right? Susan Cohen in the chat notes this, right? The text doesn't say, right? Why did the Jews revolt? Because, I don't know, Jews be revolting or something, right? He's not interested, right? These people in the provinces, they're just difficult, right? They just revolt. We don't know why. We have no sympathy for it. Next, let's talk about how he describes what actually happens during the fighting. Titus, who had been assigned to the war against the Jews, undertook them to win them over by certain representations and promises. But as they would not yield, he now proceeded to wage war upon them. The first battles he fought were indecisive. Then he got the upper hand and proceeded to besiege Jerusalem. This city had 3 walls, including the one that surrounded the temple. And they don't mean it was a triangle, they mean there are 3 surrounding walls for protection. The Romans, accordingly, heaped up mounds against the outer wall, brought up painter engines, joined battle with all who sallied forth to fight and repulsed them, and had with their slings and arrows kept back all the defenders of the wall, for they had many slingers and bowmen that had been sent by some of the barbarian kings. Okay, so the Romans are fighting against the Jews, using siege warfare, but what they're basically doing is making these giant ramps so they can bring their weapons up, up against the wall. Now, I'm seeing some folks in the chat wonder about the relationship between Jews and Rome. And here I'm going to say it was complicated. Right? If you asked those of us who are joining in from the United States, if you asked what is the relationship between Jews and the government, and I am not asking that, do not start sharing that in the chat. That's not the question I'm asking. What I want to note is, depending on who you asked, you would get wildly different responses. Right? If you asked a question about the relationship between Jews and citizenship, even those, right, those of us who are, for example, American citizens, what do we feel like, how do we feel about our citizenship, about our belonging, right? Those are really complicated questions for us today, and they were really complicated questions in the ancient world. So there are Jews who are Roman citizens and who feel strongly identified as Roman citizens and also as Jews. There are Jews like the Zealots who are really uncomfortable with that. Now you'll notice Cassius Dio doesn't sort of recognize that kind of complexity, right? And that's important. Now let's look at one other sentence here, right? The last sentence, this is where the number 3 is. The Jews were assisted by many of their countrymen from the region around about, and by many who professed the same religion, not only from the Roman Empire, but also from beyond the Euphrates. Right. So Cassius Dio tells us that the Romans are being joined by all of these groups who are partially affiliated with them, maybe are, you know, um, like vassal countries, but not fully integrated into the empire yet. And the Jews are also getting joined about, right? Jews are joining them from other parts of the Roman Empire, from Alexandria, right, from Turkey today, and they're also being joined by Jews from Babylonia, right? So this becomes a real regional conflict. That though a breach in the wall was made by what was made in the wall by means of engines, nevertheless the capture of the place did not immediately follow even then. On the contrary, the defenders killed great numbers that tried to crowd through the opening, and they also set fire to some of the buildings nearby, hoping thus to check the further progress of the Romans, even though they should gain possession of the wall, right? So the Jews set fires in order to create almost like a fire break between the Romans and the the Jews in the city. In this way, the Jews not only damaged the wall, but at the same time unintentionally burned down the barrier around the sacred precinct, so that the entrance to the temple was now laid open to the Romans. Nevertheless, because the soldiers, because of their superstition, did not immediately rush in, but at last, under compulsion from Titus, they made their way inside. Then the Jews defended themselves much more vigorously than before, as if they had discovered a piece of rare good fortune in being able to fight near the temple and fall in its defense. The populace was stated below in the court, the senators on the steps, and the priests in the sanctuary itself. And though they were but a handful fighting against a far superior force, they were not conquered until a part of the temple was set on fire. Then they met death willingly, some throwing themselves on the swords of the Romans, some slaying one another, some taking their own lives, and still others leaping into the flames. And it seemed to everybody, and especially to them, that so far from being destruction, it was victory and salvation and happiness to them that they perished along with the temple. So this is Cassius Dio's account. It's in many ways, I mean, all of the accounts are heartbreaking. Um, if you are looking for things to read on Tisha B'Av, these historical accounts, to me, really highlight just the destructiveness, the terror of this war on those who were willing to fight and those who got caught in the crossfire. So let's again take our step back. According to Cassius Dio, who destroyed the temple and why?
Folks are welcome to put it in the chat or raise their hands. Okay, well, and once again, the chat moves suddenly quickly, and I can't keep up with the scroll. Jews destroyed the temple as martyrs. Jews at first by accident. He's blaming the Jews. It was accidental that the wall was burned. Titus, Jewish martyrdom, unless we take down some of the bad guys with us.
Okay.
Romans and perhaps the Jews whose efforts to deter the Romans backfired. Then they martyred themselves, Roman soldiers. Sorry, I'm getting them out of order.
That's okay. So let's think about those, right? So we've got sort of two different pieces here. One piece is who destroyed the wall outside the temple that gave people access. And that Cassius Dio says is something that the Jews did, right? They tried to create this fire break and it didn't work. And in fact, the fire spread and allowed the Romans to access the temple. Now, who actually destroyed the temple? He says the Romans, but he's even more specific than that, right? Who's the one who's really pushing them to do this? I can go back.
Titus.
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 Right?
Yes, sorry, I'm reading the comments as they come in.
Okay, great.
Not me
Right,
speaking,
Titus.
it is everyone else speaking.
I assumed, right? Titus. It is absolutely Titus, according to Cassius Dio. Now, why would Cassius Dio insist that it was Titus, that Titus was the military leader who destroyed the temple? Anyone have any ideas? Right, we talked about how Josephus probably doesn't want to blame his patrons. So why would Cassius Dio be like, yeah, totally Titus? So Berkowitz notes, right, it makes Titus sound strong. Absolutely. More fame, says Carlo, so he can become the next emperor, right? And let's be honest, Cassius Dio is writing after Titus became an emperor. So he knows Titus is gonna become the emperor. So he's sort of building up his own nation's history, right? Think about the ways that so many of us want the people who founded our countries to have been good people, right? To have fit modern morals, whatever those are, right? And so he's telling a story about the leaders of his nation in which they follow the morals of his nation, right? We put down rebellions, we are strong and mighty, and we don't think twice about winning wars. Absolutely. And just so everyone is clear, Cassius Dio is not Jewish, right? He is there, right? To be Roman might be to also be Jewish. Josephus is Roman and Jewish. Cassius Dio is Roman and not Jewish. Okay, so let's move on to our third account. Our third account is from the Babylonian Talmud. Now, those of you who I see during our daily dose of Talmud, you are experts at this, but I know we have some other folks who've joined us, so let me just share. The Talmud is a rabbinic text from Babylonia, which is today Iraq, and it is a collectively authored, right? A collectively authored text by a group called the rabbis who are Jewish. The pieces that we're going to look at today likely date from the 5th and 6th centuries CE. So now we're talking 400 years after the destruction of the temple, and we're talking about a group of people who lived in a different empire, both at the time of the destruction and in their own lives. And I might also note here that the Sasanian Empire is largely uh, doesn't have quite so adversarial a relationship to its religious minorities and specifically the Jews as we think about the Romans having, perhaps. There's a lot of debate about that, but a different empire has a very different culture, policy, all of those things, right? We don't want to just say everybody in the ancient world was one way. So that's the Babylonian Talmud. And the Babylonian Talmud tells the story of the revolt and the destruction of the temple in Tractate Gittin. Again, those of us who've done Daf Yomi, we've seen this, but here is the story that the Talmud tells. Jerusalem was destroyed on account of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. There was a certain man whose friend was named Kamsa and whose enemy was named Bar Kamsa. You can imagine the confusion that is about to ensue. He made a large feast and said to his servant, "Go and bring me Kamsa." The servant went and brought him Bar Kamsa, his enemy. The host came and found Bar Kamsa sitting at the feast. The host said to Bar Kamsa, "That man is my enemy. What do you want here?" Right? He says, "You are my enemy. What are you doing here? Get up and leave." Bar Kamsa said to him, "Since I've already come, please let me stay, and I will give you money for whatever I eat and drink. Right? Don't throw me out. I'll just pay you for what I'm eating and drinking." The host said to him, "No." Bar Kamsa said to him, "I will give you money for half the feast. Just don't send me away." The host said to him, "No." Bar Kamsa then said to him, "I will give you money for the entire feast." The host said to him, "No." Finally, he took Bar Kamsa by his hand, stood him up, and took him out. Right? He throws him out physically. Bar Kamsa said to himself, since the sages were sitting there and did not protest, right? There were all of these people there, including rabbis, and nobody said boo at this behavior. Learn from it that they were content with what he did, right? Silence equals consent, says Bar Kamsa. So I will go and inform against them to the king, right? These people are terrible. I'm going to go tell the Roman emperor that they are the worst. He went and said to the emperor, the Jews have rebelled against you. Right? So he goes and he lies and he says, the Jews have rebelled against you. The emperor said to him, says who? Right? What's your evidence for that? Bar Kamsa said to him, send them an offering and see whether they will sacrifice it, right? Send an offering on your behalf to the temple and see if they sacrifice it. If they sacrifice it, then clearly they want God to favor you and to bring you good health. If they refuse to sacrifice it, clearly they want God to reject you and you to, be the worst. The emperor went and sent with him a 3-year-old calf, right, which is a very high quality sacrifice. While Bar Kamsa was coming with the calf, he made a blemish on its upper lip, and some say on its eyelids, a place where, according to us, it is a blemish, us being the rabbis, but according to them, non-Jews, it is not a blemish. Okay, so the emperor sends an animal with Bar Kamsa to be sacrificed on his behalf. And as he's taking him on the road, Bar Kamsa makes some kind of blemish or cut on the animal. Now, sacrifices to the temple have to be perfect, right? You give God the absolute best. So something with a blemish is not understood, right? Is not an appropriate sacrifice. We don't give broken things to God. We give beautiful, whole things to God, according to rabbinic logic. We can agree or disagree with that, but that's the assumption underlying this story. So it gets there, and the rabbis don't know what to do, right? What do we do with this sacrifice, which we really is not appropriate, should not be offered because it's not appropriate? The sages thought to sacrifice it to maintain peace with the government. Maybe we just sacrifice it anyways, because otherwise he's going to get really mad at us. Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkolas said to them, if the priests do that, people will say that blemished animals might be sacrificed on the altar. Right? If you sacrifice it, everyone's going to think, oh, we can sacrifice anything on the altar now. There are no rules. The sages thought to kill him as Bar Kamsa, so he would not go and speak against them. Right? Okay, well, if he goes back and tells the emperor we didn't sacrifice it, then we're going to be in trouble. So maybe we just don't let him go back. Rabbi Zechariah said to them, if you kill him, people will say that one who makes a blemish on sacrificial animals is to be killed. Right? People are going to learn the wrong thing from us killing Bar Kamsa, so we can't do it. Rabbi Yochanan says, the excessive humility of Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkolas destroyed our temple, burned our sanctuary, and exiled us from our land. Right? They didn't do anything. They just refused to sacrifice the animal. Bar Kamsa went back, presumably, and told the emperor, and the emperor says, oh, they really are rebelling against us. And then he comes to put down the rebellion. So this is a little bit later in the story. I skipped a piece in the interest of time, but Vespasian is fighting, and then he has to go back to Rome, right, to become the emperor, and he sent Titus. The Talmud then quotes a verse from Deuteronomy, and he shall say, where is their God, their rock in whom they trusted? This is the wicked Titus, right? Who's the he that's talking here? The rabbis of the Talmud say that he is Titus, who insulted and blasphemed God on high. What did Titus do? He took a zonah. I left this untranslated because it's not quite clear how to read it here. Promiscuous woman, sex worker, woman who he's about to make a promiscuous woman. It's really unclear how we should translate this word here. But he takes a woman of some kind with his hand, and he entered the Holy of Holies with her. He spread out a Torah scroll and committed a sin on it. The rabbis are being euphemistic here. The sin presumably relates to the zonah that he's brought in, and they are engaging in sexual activity on a Torah scroll in the Holy of Holies. Afterward, he took a sword and cut into the curtain separating between the sanctuary and the Holy of Holies. And a miracle was performed and blood spurted forth. And he thought that he had killed God. As it is stated, your enemies roar in the midst of your meeting place. They have set up their own signs for signs. Okay. So let's again take our step back. According to the Talmud, who destroyed the temple and why? Again, you should feel free to raise your hand. We can find unmute you. But if you want to keep putting it in the chat, you are welcome to.
You found a third picture of the destruction of the temple in classical art.
Yes, there are a lot of them.
Okay. Hatred between Jews. Some people said that at the top of this hour too, right?
Yeah.
And I also saw Sinat Chinam pasted into the chat at the top of the hour, which is like sort of free flowing hatred, I guess you would say.
Yeah, right. Baseless, right? Hatred for no reason almost.
Right. Susan says Bar Kamsa drove the series of events, but ultimately Titus did the job. And another opinion that it was the piety of the the excessive piety of the rabbis.
Yeah.
Comment
So,
that Titus defiled the temple, but it was because of perceived. I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time with the scroll. Perceived rebellion.
mhm. Right.
Excessive
And
punctilious behavior of the rabbis who refused to permit Bar Kamsa's killing. Jews, even rabbis, acting horribly to one another and did not call one another out on it.
okay, yeah, you're hitting all of the right notes here, right? So the Talmud is clear. Who destroyed the temple physically is Titus. We get very explicit descriptions of Titus's destroying the temple. But who actually caused the destruction of the temple? We get two different answers here that are both related to what you're saying, right? One answer is the event of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, right? Which is an event around people who treat each other terribly and leadership who sits by and says nothing when it happens, right? So that's one piece of this. And the second piece of this is the excessive humility of Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkolias, who won't let them just sacrifice this animal, even though it's not great, and also won't let them kill the witness. So now we get to, right, so that's who destroyed the temple. Now we get to the question that I see Keely asking, which is did why was the temple destroyed according to the Talmud? According to what we read, why was the temple destroyed? Mm. So Rebecca notes that it was defiled, and that's part of how it was destroyed. You're absolutely right. That's part of how it was destroyed. The bigger theological question then is why? And I'm seeing three different answers so far, right? So Beth in San Diego says God's anger. Eleanor says the perceived rebellion. And Naomi notes because of our behavior towards one another. And I think that those are the exact right three reasons, right? I think that those are the reasons that the Talmud identifies as um, as the reasons, right? We had major internal Jewish dysfunction, which angered God, who put these events in play. Right. The internal dysfunction sets these events in motion. So, those are our three ancient accounts of the destruction of the temple. Now, how do we make sense of these three different ancient accounts, right? How do we think about the fact that we have three ancient accounts that pretty dramatically disagree with each other, right? Any thoughts? How do we make sense of these three different ancient accounts?
Aaron points out that the Babylonian rabbis have an agenda. They perhaps have an interest in rebuilding the temple, and so they see it as our fault, like Jews' fault, and therefore something Jews can fix. That while perhaps that taking the blame on Jews is in its own way empowering, in fact.
Well, and I think certainly Aaron, that's a point. That's a really important point. And we might also think they're not living under Rome. So in some ways, they are less angry at Rome all the time because they are not dealing with Rome in their face all the time. And so that also gives them space to do some internal reflection about their own role historically in these events. Yeah. Phyllis notes really importantly that the account depends on the intended audience, right? That the account depends on the intended. Who are we talking to? And what are we trying to get them to do, right? Are we talking to people in the first century who just went through this, who are trying to make sense of it theologically, but also politically? Are we folks in the second century trying to celebrate the amazing Roman emperors and all of their awesomeness? Are we living in the fifth and sixth century in exile, in um, in a time and place where this is actually really far from us? I actually think, right, I mean, many years ago, Dr. Scheinerman reminded me that the rabbis of the Talmud are further from the destruction of the temple than we are from the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And I don't know how many of you are still actively angry at Henry Wilkes Booth. I'm going to be honest with you, I'm not. I have limited emotional energy in the world and it is not focused on John Wilkes Booth. So there is um, there is a real distance here, which allows them to do other things with this story around, as you guys are noticing right here, self-reflection, thinking about what this means for their own communities and how we relate to each other. Absolutely. So I want to go take us back then to our big questions that we started with, right? Question one, what happened in the year 70? What happened in the year 70 is a complicated piece. On the one hand, we can say the Romans destroyed the temple. On the other hand, right, I think we also have to recognize that depending on who's telling the story, it may have been right, it was part of a much broader historical and theological movement that we can't ignore. Our second question is why was the temple destroyed? And there, I think we've seen a number of really different answers in the ancient world. And I'm seeing folks in the comments note that even people today offer different answers to this question based on the message they're trying to communicate to their communities. Right? So Pamela, I see, wrote, "This is what contemporary rabbis do with the story or stories in the temple as well." And I see somebody else a while back said maybe the temple was destroyed because God was saying, I don't want to be worshiped through sacrifice anymore, but in another way, right? We're seeing all of these other different answers, um, all of these different answers to why the temple was destroyed that offer meaning to communities in the ancient world and today. And that leads me to our third question, right? How do we as individuals and as communities find meaning in the destruction of the temple on Tisha B'Av, right? We have now seen people tell this story in different ways to reach different communities. But we ourselves are part of different communities, and we're part of a shared community of people here right now. So, how do we tell this story in a way that was found in a way that is meaningful to us, right? Is the story of Roman imperial violence the story that resonates with us? Is the story of internal Jewish fighting one that resonates with us? Is a story of a dysfunctional government and people standing up and saying enough and then being killed one that resonates with us? Or is there a different version of that story that resonates more with us? And I'm genuinely curious, right? How do we tell this story? I am some of us in this room are parents. Our grandparents, you may have children who ask you at some point, wait, what happened on Tisha B'Av? What are we doing? Right? How do we actually tell that story? Given that there is no one, here is the historically accurate way to tell that story. How do we choose to tell it today? Let me look through the chat and see what y'all are suggesting. So
I see
Eleanor
it.
suggests it strikes me that we shouldn't bicker among ourselves because great and terrible things will happen. Mhm. Now, I'm not sure about bicker, right? I mean, there are real questions here that they are fighting out. So certainly they are fighting. Sharon suggests it was the problem of how they were sacrificing, right? Focusing on the details instead of what was in their heart. How many times did God, through the prophets, ask for repentance, not through a system, but by rendering their hearts, looking after the poor and the widow? Aaron says, we turned this tragedy into a triumph when the rabbis created a portable religion from the ashes. And Paul suggests it makes Jewish practice into, wait, I lost Paul, possible thousands of miles away from Jerusalem. Yoram suggests that, we have to be aware that most stories have multiple perspectives and we can pick and choose, or at least be aware that there are multiple perspectives as we tell these stories. Absolutely. Now, I do want to caution us. Um, I think we have a lot of, I want to caution us not to look for the silver lining. I think we as people are conditioned to try to figure out the positive. And Judaism does that many days of the year. Tisha B'Av is the one day where we actually are supposed to sit with the destruction, with the sadness, right? And so I agree with you that Tisha B'Av allows for all kinds, right? The destruction on Tisha B'Av is what, in some ways, allows Rabbinic Judaism to flourish. But this particular day is not about that triumphal story. It's about the destruction. And whether or not you think that that needed to happen, all of these accounts describe tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people dying of disease and starvation and violence in war. And that is worth stopping and being sad about. Now, what we are sad about is a debate. Um, but I absolutely think we should sit with what happened, but we should also sit with, as I'm seeing folks notice in the chat, the different ways that we tell these stories to make meaning for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren, for our students, for our communities. And understand that when we tell these stories, we're also making choices about what to highlight and what lessons to take from it. Because the one thing that I certainly think we can all agree with is that there are a lot of lessons to be learned from this story. Um, there are lessons in each of these ancient accounts. There are lessons that you have brought into our discussion. There are more lessons than any of us have named here today. And so sitting with those, I think, is one thing that we can do, at least for a little bit of time on Sunday, when we are marking the 9th of Av. So with that, I even had that there. With that, let me thank you for spending this hour with us, whether it's your breakfast hour or your lunch hour or your dinner hour, and for learning with us. And I wish those of you who are fasting in some way an easy, meaningful fast. And I wish all of us some more ability to think about the stories that we get told about our past.
Thank you, Dr. Ronis. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for such thoughtful and insightful comments, so many perspectives that come so fast on Zoom. That is one of the really unique things about doing classes on Zoom is we can just have so much conversation happen at such a lightning speed and see so many perspectives. And I agree with you, Dr. Ronis, that sitting in the pain is the point of Tisha B'Av, not finding the silver linings. It is I find very hard for especially like Westerners and Americans to not try and flex to the silver lining. But I think it is so important, perhaps an important counter-cultural Jewish value. So I won't wish you a good Tisha B'Av, but I hope that it is meaningful, and we will see you next week. Okay, take care, everyone.